Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Okay, good. Basically the point I'm trying to make, well, maybe I should start by excusing myself. I'm coming in here for a colleague who had a last minute empêchement, so she couldn't be here, so I've been jumping in at the last moment. So I didn't have as much time to prepare as maybe it would have been desirable. So I'll try to be as useful with my speech as I can be, given the time constraints that I'm having. So basically, the point I'm trying to make here today is that good spatial planning obviously is something that's really, really important, but it's not going to work in isolation. So you can have the best spatial planning in the world, but basically if your incentive structures, your governance structures don't really work, you're not going to achieve very much. And that's what I'm trying to explain you today. And I'll be starting by basically metropolitan areas, because that's also very important, and that's maybe it's even kind of like more important than rural linkages, because that's where the largest part of your population lives. And basically, if a lot of stuff doesn't happen in the metropolitan areas, or the planning in the metropolitan areas doesn't really succeed in the aims that you're having for your country, then that's probably going to be, even much worse than if you're messing up your rural linkages, basically. But then in the second part of my presentation, I will also be talking about the rural languages. So, metropolitan governance. So basically, we did a project in the OECD roughly 10 years ago, where we are looking at how governance structures in cities are affecting the economic and infrastructure and social outcomes in the cities. And what we found during this project is that these governance structures are incredibly important. For example, one of the things we were looking at was what we called municipal fragmentation. What we did was we compared for a given city size, for a given population size, the number of municipalities you had in this, what we call functional areas. So we would not just look at the core city, but we also looked at the municipalities that basically belonged to the urban agglomeration, who was, as a socioeconomic area. And when we're looking at that, we saw that if you had a higher degree of municipal fragmentation, so basically more municipalities for a given population size, you did much worse. You did much worse in your transport infrastructure, you had much worse public transport, you had much worse environmental outcomes, and overall you had much lower levels of productivity. So basically, when you had twice as many municipalities for a given population size, your productivity was 6% lower. So that basically means you lost 6% of your GDP every single year. And you can have, more than twice as much municipalities than somebody else. You can have 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So you can use a lot on productivity, in quality of infrastructure, and into the well-functioning of your metropolitan area if you're having bad governance structures. And that doesn't only hold for municipalities. It also holds, for example, regions. We have seen again and again, when you're having metropolitan areas that are straddling several regions in the countries, a lot of the outcomes are not optimal because the regions are not cooperating as they should. So governance structures are incredibly important, and that's something that actually most economists are totally ignoring. And I don't know how much of you are aware of that in that room, but it really is a huge problem. Housing also is the reason. Housing shortage is also to a large degree driven by governance structures. What do I mean here? In most countries, the ultimate decision of when, where, and what housing is built is depending on the mayors. Now, the mayors are elected by the people who are there. The people who are there often don't have a strong incentive of having new housing built. So the mayors often basically do not allow housing to be built in the city that they are the mayor of. Or if they allow housing to be built, they allow big houses to be built, or big apartments, because everybody wants a rich neighbor and nobody wants a poor neighbor. So basically a lot of housing, affordable housing, is not being built, has not been built, will not be built because of governance problems. And while all the mayors will agree that in their metropolitan area there's a strong need for building housing, they will all individually oppose housing in their part of the metropolitan area, in their municipality. And that again is the failure of the governance structures, because that means basically fundamentally that decisions that are having a strong effect on others are not taken at a level where basically the spillovers and the negative effects on others are taken into account. So fundamentally what it means and what I've been talking about is that basically too many decisions are taken at too small a level in metropolitan areas, and that certain functions need to be taken at a higher level. Otherwise we'll be ending up not having enough infrastructure, having bad infrastructure, having infrastructure in the wrong place, and not having enough housing. And that is really important, and you can have all the best planners in the world. If basically you have a governance structure like that, that's not going to change, because they're making plans, but then the plans, they're not implemented, or the plans, they're only kind of like partially, at the right scale. So that really is a huge problem, and that really needs to be addressed. Now, what kind of solutions do we have? One solution, and certain countries have been going this way, for example Korea, is you're creating relatively large cities. So basically your city is more or less spanning your whole functional urban area, your whole metropolitan agglomeration, and that in a way solves a lot of these problems. In other countries, mainly for political reasons, that's not a welcome solution. So in that case, what you need to achieve is that there is cooperation between the municipalities, and that certain decisions are not taken at the municipal level but at a higher level. So there's various ways you can do that. One form is having kind of like governance bodies, is what we call them. Think something, for example, like Greater London or these types. I mean, different countries having different governance bodies, but it's really important that you have them. And then obviously you need to make sure that the planning then takes place at a scale where it then actually also takes into account all these externalities that we've been talking about. So basically, for example, at the level of the metropolitan area, not just the level of its own municipalities. Now what I'm telling you is not all news. I mean, there's a lot of countries have been moving in that directions. For example, France, Korea, UK, Poland, Romania, and many more have been moving towards having stronger metropolitan governance bodies over the last decades. Give you just some examples. For example, in Poland, you have super local planning through the Krakow Metropolitan Strategy 2030. And it basically, Poland has identified 7 key collaboration areas, and that's including environment and spatial planning and mobility, and where basically these decisions are taken at a higher level than municipality. In Romania, in the national urban policy, they have also specifically advocated that spatial planning should be taking place at the functional urban area scale, and then also, so basically I've been talking to you about the problem of municipal fragmentation in metropolitan areas, but that's not necessarily only a problem in metropolitan areas. But there's countries where have a relatively large number of municipalities per capita. For example, France is an example. They got 30,000 municipalities. That's, 5 or 10 times more per capita than in other countries. And then obviously you have a lot of municipal fragmentation even in rural areas. And then you also need to overcome that if you don't want to address the problem having too many municipalities. And what has been coming up in France is, for example, what they call intercommunalities. So that basically is associations of several municipalities who are taking care of certain tasks in municipalities. Some municipalities are too small. Or they're also having territorial coherence plans, consulates, that's called. So that's basic planning at above a municipal level scale. So that's the first part on metropolitan governance. The second part, I'm going to talk about strengthening urban-rural linkages more specifically. As you may know, strengthening rural-urban linkages is something that's very important for the OECD. It's a core pillar, both of our rural and urban policy and the principles that we're having. So in 2019, the OECD approved principles of urban policy and another set of principles of rural policy. And in both of them, the strengthening of rural-urban linkages is an important priority. And maybe I just read it. Basically what we're having there, we're saying by leveraging spatial continuity and functional relations between urban and rural areas to inform public investments and program design, and by carrying out joint strategies and fostering win-win rural-urban partnerships as appropriate to promote an integrated development approach. So that's basically what we are understanding by rural-urban linkages, and that's something, as I said, that's really important. Now, probably everybody in the room will agree that these rural-urban linkages are really important, but apparently there's not made enough effort in policy making to address the problem. For example, we have been launching a a joint report with UN Habitat yesterday on the global state of national policy. And that report reveals that only in 45% of the national policies, there is any mention of specific actions for rural linkages. So that basically half of the countries, in their policies, they are specifically neglecting or looking beyond the issue of rural linkages. Now, there's also some good examples from certain countries where policies are looking at this issue. For example, in Switzerland, there's a policy for mountainous regions and other rural areas, where specifically the strengthening of rural linkages is one of the factors there. In Germany, we have what we call in German Metropolregionen, which is basically metropolitan regions that go beyond the urban agglomerations that are centered on that, and also include a very large amount of rural areas beyond. And those Metropolregionen are actively trying to establish good links between the urban agglomerations and the rural areas that are served. Also, for example, in Colombia, the OECD, we've been doing a territorial review recently. And after this, there's been a revision of the national policies that is also specifically trying to strengthen the links between urban and rural areas. So what are some of the key lessons that we have learned how to make rural linkages work? The first one is you need something of a framework. You can't just say we want that and then it's happened magically. That's not the way things work. You need a framework, you need incentive structures that are really giving incentives to both the people in the rural areas and the urban areas to work together. Cooperation is something that's difficult and that requires effort. So if you don't have structures that are incentivizing people to do it, second point, building trust. A lot of areas, the core cities and the surrounding rural areas are not actively trusting each other very much. People in the city, they often think that people in the rural areas, they don't really understand. The people in the rural areas and the people in the cities, they are kind of very, shall I say, unfriendly. And they're relying on their food and they really don't understand the importance of the rural areas around them. So there really is an issue that there's not much trust. So basically, what you also need to establish is that people actually meet each other, try to get to know each other, and develop trust. And one of the ways you can do that is just having some small projects, just starting small, just doing some simple things that then also usually work well, so that people can get to know each other, can get to trust each other, can see that if they're working together, they actually can achieve things that are positive for everybody, and that they can have achieved on their own. Then what's also very important, obviously, is digital connectivity. Digital connectivity, having good internet access, is not going to ensure that your rural area is going to do well. But if you don't have digital connectivity, then it ensures that your rural area is basically not going anywhere. And so if you don't have digital connectivity, basically you're out. So it's really important that we're also having increasingly better internet access in rural areas. We're regularly monitoring that in the OECD. There's still huge gaps between internet quality, internet speed, internet access in rural and urban areas, in the OECD and beyond. So that's still, it's been improving in recent years, but that's still a very large problem that needs to be fixed. I'll stop here. There's some other things I may bring up later, but I think I've largely used my